Good evening. Welcome to New Horizons Engineering Distinguished Lecture Series. My name is Mark Christensen, and I am privileged to serve as president of Clarkson University. The New Horizons Distinguished Lecture Series brings together nationally renowned engineers to campus, in this case, virtually, to discuss topics that are of vital importance to engineering. To date, Clarkson's been fortunate to have 19 eminent speakers talk to our students and faculty. The lecture series was established in 2010 with a generous financial support from Professor Liya Regel. Professor Regel is a distinguished research professor of engineering in electrical and computer engineering and mechanical and aeronautical engineering. She also holds an honorary degree of science from Clarkson University. A distinctive feature of the New Horizons Distinguished Lecture Series is that all of the speakers are members of the National Academy of Engineering. Election to the National Academy membership is one of the highest professional honors accorded to an engineer. Members have distinguished themselves in business and in academic management, in technical positions, as university faculty, and as leaders in government and private engineering organizations. Members are elected to the NAE by their peers, current NAE members. Over the last 2 years, the New Horizons lecture was not held due to COVID, and it's wonderful to restart the New Horizons program, and I thank Dr. Rick Miller for being with us tonight to give the New Horizons lecture. Dr. Miller's New Horizons topic is the future of engineering education. He's going to talk to you about the founding of Olin College and all that's been happening there. I was fortunate enough to meet him back in 2012, just before I became dean, when I was teaching an intro to electrical engineering class and got to participate in one of Olin's renowned hands-on workshops on the topic. At the time, I became absolutely entranced by what had happened there, and I think you're going to really in for a treat tonight to hear a bit about Olin's journey and how they're transforming the face of engineering education. Our Dean of Engineering, Bill Jamison, will now introduce Dr. Miller.
Thank you, Mark. I would also like to thank Dr. Liya Regel for her support and personal effort associated with the New Horizons program. This would not be possible without you, Liya. I know you're out there, so thank you. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Rick Miller as our 20th New Horizons in Engineering Distinguished Lecturer. Dr. Miller earned his BS at the University of California, Davis, his master's from MIT, and the PhD from the California Institute of Technology. He started his career as a faculty member at the University of California, Santa Barbara, moving progressively into more responsible administrative roles as Associate Dean of Engineering at USC and as the Dean of Engineering at the University of Iowa before being named president of Olin College in 1999. Dr. Miller was the first employee of Olin College, and he served as its president until 2020. Since its founding, Olin has been at the forefront of innovation in engineering education. Dr. Miller created a culture of bold experimentation and collaboration at Olin that transformed the way that they educate their students. In addition to providing a world-class undergraduate education to their students, Olin has influenced more than 800 universities from more than 50 countries around the world in the last 10 years by sharing what they do and how they educate their students. We will learn about Olin's journey of innovation this evening, and I hope that all of the faculty in attendance will reflect deeply upon this, the transformative lessons that Dr. Miller will share with us. And this talk is extremely timely for us here at Clarkson, as we are embarking on our own journey to transform Clarkson engineering through the Solinsky Engineering Leadership Challenge, made possible by the generous financial commitment of Ken and Grace Solinsky. Olin's influence and impact is so great because they are one of the few schools in the country that lead with a value proposition that's based on the way that they educate their students. The average Olin graduate today has completed more than 20 design build team projects and explored starting a business. Their educational model is distinctive, and I'm sure Dr. Miller will argue tonight better than some of the more traditional ways of educating students. Dr. Miller's efforts and impact at Olin have been recognized widely. He serves on multiple advisory boards, and he's received numerous awards. I'll just mention a couple here. He is an elected fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the National Academy of Inventors, and a member of the National Academy of Engineering. He's a co-recipient of the National Academy of Engineering Bernard M. Gordon Prize for Innovation in Engineering and Technology Education. He's the only person to have won that award twice, first in 2013 and again in 2022. In 2017, he co-founded the Coalition for Life Transformative Education, an organization that believes in the transformative power of education and where he continues to advocate for positive change in the way we educate future generations of engineers. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Miller. Rick?
Good evening, everyone. It's such a privilege to be with you. I wish I could be there in person. Turns out that a number of circumstances conspired against that, and I'm so grateful that Clarkson has been willing to compromise with me to allow me to do this remotely. I'm going to share my screen now in order to enable us to move quickly. Let's see if I can get this to work. That should work. All right, I'm assuming that this is now visible to everyone at Clarkson. I'm going to tell you something about the journey that Olin went on, what it is and how it got where it is, and the very odd, highly risky proposition that founded it, and then the lessons learned and what all of us can learn from this. And in fact, in 2020, I stepped down early as president because I kept getting these letters from parents that saying, "What did you do to my kid?" They are completely different now. And I realized that this positive effect that was happening had relatively little to do with the study of differential equations in engineering and everything to do with the culture of learning. And so I believe that students in any field can learn this. So with that as background, I'm going to see if I can get this to work. There we go. That worked. So about Olin, there's a picture of Mr. Olin, who was raised in Vermont. In 1997, the F.W. Olin Foundation decided to end their generous grants program and devote all the rest of their resources to starting over in engineering education. There was a great deal of unhappiness about engineering at that time. In fact, there were a lot of institutions that had tried to make change. Something some of you might remember, the National Academy of Engineering's Engineering Education Coalitions program in the 90s. They spent over $100 million, I believe, and abandoned it 5 years later in desperation that it was not doing much to change education. That's when the Olin Foundation said, when society faces a challenge that is resistant to change for a generation or more, usually the problem is the assumptions behind it. There are some sacred cows here, which people are afraid to challenge, and that is why we're not able to get the breakthrough. So they decided in 1997 to start over. By the way, the F.W. Olin Foundation is not the same thing as the John M. Olin Foundation or the Spencer T. Olin Foundation or the Olin Corporation's Foundation. Franklin W. Olin was the founder of the company. He retired in 1938. He started a foundation with just he and his wife to do good in the world. And in 1951, when he passed away, they began this gifts program, which developed buildings, funding for buildings in universities around the US. They've funded, in fact, 78 buildings on 58 university campuses. There's an Olin Hall at Johns Hopkins, at Vanderbilt, at the University of Southern California, at dozens and dozens of institutions, which has also been a problem for becoming distinguished from all the rest. So when I arrived in 1999 as the first employee, Olin College was not yet a place. It was an idea. There were 4 directors of the Olin Foundation and me. By the way, none of them as an engineer, and none of them had ever worked in higher education. What could go wrong with that? My wife was really the first to figure out that this could be a problem. Nevertheless, we arrived in 1999 and began negotiating with Babson College to purchase the land for a campus. In 2000, we broke ground for the campus construction. We began to add some founding faculty. And in 2001, we started this year of experimentation, which we call the Olin Partner Year. This was so much of what happened at Olin as the result of that. I'll spend a little bit of time on it later. The bottom line is, in the Olin Partner Year, 15 boys and 15 girls spent the year in construction trailers in a parking lot while the campus was being built. They were not taking classes. They were not students. They didn't graduate early. They were partners in experimenting to try to see what actually happens when you do things that break the rules. 2002, we had a campus and we began to teach our first courses. And in 2006, we graduated our first students. So we haven't really been graduating students for 20 years yet. let's see, there we go. This is Mr. Milas, whose name is on the administration building at Olin. He was the president of the F.W. Olin Foundation and the founding chairman of the board. And he's the one whose vision and commitment of funds, more than $460 million to start over again. He declared there's a lot of unhappiness about the way engineering is taught today, and that was a widespread concern. This is a startup, but it was not an uninformed startup. For example, we had advice from Joe Bordogna at the National Science Foundation, who was the chief operating officer at the time, and also the person who created the Engineering Education Coalitions program, and also John Prados, who was at that time the president of ABET. He's the one who created or at least shepherded the development of the Criteria 2000 program. If you look at the founding precepts of Olin, this is a document where the Olin Foundation declared the purpose of the school and also the requirements for spending from the endowment. It states very clearly in the preamble that Olin College is intended to be different, not for the mere sake of being different, but in order to become an important and constant contributor to the advancement of engineering education in America and throughout the world. Our interpretation of that, Olin College is intended to become an education laboratory by design. We haven't yet found another institution with a similar mission. So interpreting this, the role of Olin College is roughly like this. You can imagine this aircraft carrier in a harbor, which represents all of higher education. And Olin College, on the other hand, is this little tugboat pushing at 90 degrees on the bow. The purpose for Olin is to nudge higher education in a new direction. You don't want the aircraft carrier to follow the tugboat. The two are built in a completely different way, and that's by design. In this case, Olin doesn't offer tenure. We have no academic departments. Every student gets at least $100,000 in merit scholarships. And essentially, everything at Olin has an expiration date. At least that's our mentality. During the Olin partner year, we tried a lot of crazy things. We observed them. We were impressed with our miscalculation of what students can do and how education actually works. The first thing that I would say is probably true everywhere in the world is that students are much more capable of independent learning than we think. The structure that we put around it, the examinations are more for our benefit than it is for theirs. Engineering is not a body of knowledge. It's a process. After all, the Wright brothers, for example, invented the aerospace field. These are two bicycle mechanics from Ohio who kept jumping off a hill saying there must be a better way and iterating. That, in fact, is the process of engineering. And such a small fraction of our time in universities today is devoted to that process that it offers a huge opportunity for improvement. We also noticed that working in teams can create a momentum of learning. Let me explain that. When I went to school a zillion years ago, we had to do homework problem sets. Problem solving was supposed to be the brand of engineering. So we spent most of our weekends sitting at our desk by ourselves solving problem sets. When you got stuck on a problem, you weren't supposed to ask your neighbor because that would be cheating. Instead, you turned it in, and a couple of weeks later, there was a sentence or two scribbled in red on the paper, and that's supposed to give you a hint as to what went wrong. If you don't do that, if you create teams and encourage them to talk to each other, what happens is that you don't wait 2 weeks in mystery when you're trying to figure out why things don't work. One of the other members of your team raises a hand and said, I tried it this way, and look at what happened. And as a result, the momentum builds and the learning speeds up at amazing speeds. This is, of course, industry's been doing this forever. Focusing on problems that matter, learning in context, and collaborating in teams can build both competence and mindset. I'm going to return to that. If I could start another institution from a blank sheet of paper, I would use that as the template for what learning is about. There are 3 reasons why engineering education needs improvement. Number 1, we're teaching the wrong people. I'll talk about that more later. We're teaching them the wrong stuff. And we're using teaching methods that are known to be largely ineffective. Otherwise, though, we're doing a great job. So The Olin learning model evolves constantly. I can't tell you what it will be like in 5 years, and I've been gone for 2 years, so I'm sure it's significantly different now. But some of these things have been enduring, so I'll mention them here. First off, Olin College is gender balanced. It's been hovering around 50%, some years more than 50% women, some years less than 50% women. We admit students through a process called candidates weekends, in which we are looking for multiple intelligences, not just test scores. You can't do that by reading anything. You need to meet them. So they spend a weekend on campus working in teams with others, and we observe them closely and look for a good fit. Not everybody learns the same way. So some of those students would be better off enrolling in a school somewhere else, maybe even in the Boston area. They complete 25 to 35 design build projects in the 4-year period. They explore starting a business. They have a capstone requirement, which we call SCOPE, which is an acronym, stands for something. They are corporate sponsored. So we're currently charging, I believe, $55,000 for each corporate sponsor to sponsor a team of about 4 or 5 students for 2 semesters. They have done this from the beginning. This project, I think, injects a great deal of realism, has a lot of similarity with the clinic project program at Harvey Mudd. And it's also accompanied now by a relatively new invention called affordable design and entrepreneurship. This is a nonprofit equivalent of working for a corporation. Expo. We discovered that standing and delivering in front of your peers is very hard for most people. In fact, some have claimed that the most challenging and scary thing for an incoming freshman is to do public speaking. Especially for, you know, that old story about how you can find the extroverted engineer in the crowd. He's the one who's looking at your shoes when he talks. The whole idea here is that standing in front of a group and presenting, listening is a really important storytelling exercise that shapes your identity and who you are. So Olin has a requirement that every student at the end of every semester stands and delivers in front of the entire community something of their selection from their project work. Passionate pursuits. One of the things we realize is that engineering students, contrary to popular belief, often are good at everything in high school, not just math. Many of them are musicians and are involved in drama and the arts. So rather than tell them, okay, you're in engineering school now, sell the cello and buy a laptop, we tell them, don't sell the cello. You're going to need some balance in your life, particularly during the tedious years. And so, in fact, we have been tracking on a right-hand column on the transcript, passionate pursuits for students. What is it that you really care about? It's non-degree credit. It doesn't have anything to do with graduation, but we encourage them to pursue things that matter. And we even have funding to help that. The core principles behind the success of the Olin learning model at this point are design thinking. You may know about Stanford University and the D School. In addition to that, intrinsic motivation. There's a lot of theory behind this as well. You might start with the simple work of Dan Pink in Drive, in his book. Integrated learning in context is really critical. Rather than taking problems apart into their, this is a chemistry problem, this is a business problem, and then never getting around to putting them back together before you graduate. Instead, we just get deeper and deeper into the weeds. Integrated learning in context produces a very different outcome. And then there are the intangibles. To make a better world, the unintended consequences on ethical engineering. Ethics has become absolutely critical in their world today, and you can see this in the news every night. And then the most recent development, which has really come to the fore since I've left, is called Engineering for Everyone. It's the strategic plan title for the current thrust at Olin, which has to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, focusing on ethical behavior has consequences. I just want to share with you one of our recent graduates, Frances Haugen, who was, in fact, the Facebook whistleblower. About a year ago, you may have seen her on 60 Minutes. She testified before the US Congress. She's also testified before the Parliament in Europe. and was recognized by President Biden at the State of the Union address in February of this year. Young people can and will make a difference if you put wind at their back and give them the inspiration to do the right thing. Now, the fundamental concepts behind our learning model is learning to be an engineer, not learning about engineering. This requires a different mindset. It's in this intrinsic motivation, not extrinsic motivation, is fundamental, particularly if you're looking for people who are creative and who are innovative. Not everything that's important is learned from a book. The most important things actually come from inside you, from your heart. Creativity and innovation, certainly. This is a value, this is a form of self-expression. Also, ethics and empathy, which both spring from an authentic concern for others. And design thinking is about designing with others, not for others. You don't take a course that says, here's how you design a car. You start meeting with people who live in cars or who drive in cars every day, and you engage them as partners in the design. You always begin with what kind of thing do you even need to design? It involves values, it requires creativity, ambiguity, and self-expression. These are not things that most people think of when they think of engineering. And at Olin, I think what we've noticed is an engineer is a person who envisions what has never been and does whatever it takes to make it happen, to make a better world. This is not about making technical specialists who live in an isolated world of mathematics. In fact, Olin College produces what I'd call engineering stem cells. These are people who think differently and who find ways to make an impact wherever they are. I'll give you another example from our class of 06. This is a fellow named Kevin Tostado. Kevin, in his senior project in arts and humanities, with his roommate, decided to write a feature-length screenplay for a film. It's called Yellow Lights. They happened to finish it before Christmas, so he and his roommate decided to film it. And they recruited some actors from Babson and from Wellesley. And at the end of the year, we watched the film in the auditorium. When they graduated, Kevin decided to enter this film in the Independent Film Festival Awards, and he wound up winning the Best Independent Film of the Year. Now, this has not ended his career, it just began it. He is now a producer of documentary films in Southern California. He's produced a film, the first one I think was called Under the Boardwalk, which is a documentary film about the game of Monopoly and world championships in this. So you might stop and ask, wait a minute, is that a failure? I thought he was supposed to use differential equations and build things. No, an engineer is a person who envisions what has never been and does whatever it takes to make it happen, to make a better world. That's in fact what Kevin is doing. Olin alumni now are have been out not 20 years, but they're getting to the point where they've been there near 20 years, beginning to turn heads in the workforce because they think differently. According to the latest college scorecard data released by the U.S. Department of Education in February, the Olin College alumni earn a median salary of almost $133,000 per year, 10 years after starting college, which happened to be this year, #1 in U.S. in earnings 10 years after college for any university in the U.S. Now, this isn't the way you should measure things, but it always comes up as to whether Olin's doing things so differently that the workplace doesn't know what to do with them. And so far, they've not had trouble. In addition, MIT School of Engineering in 2018 did a global benchmark study of the state of the art of engineering education. They hired Dr. Ruth Graham from the UK to monitor what the best and most creative new engineering schools in the world are. And we were shocked to discover that their data showed Olin College as #1 in the world, as measured by this opinion of education leaders on a number of continents. So we felt that the experiment is going well. And I felt after that, I might as well quit now because I'm no place to go but down. I want to switch gears now, stop talking about Olin, which is in fact a unique laboratory located, just 15 miles from Harvard and MIT. It's most educators around the world, when they're making a tour of the US, will stop in Boston to visit those schools. And we're only 15 miles away. So they come by to visit us on the same airfare, which is pretty good. And we also just catch the apples that fall off of the Harvard and MIT tree. And so there's a lot of talent. Other places that I've been would not have had the opportunity to be as influential simply because of their location. All right, let me talk about the broad sweep, back away from Olin and look at what we've learned about education across the globe. First of all, think about this as a time progression. Knowledge economy. If you look at the broad sweep of human development, there was an agrarian economy, there was an industrial economy, and then a knowledge economy. In fact, the World Bank for many years had their vision for making a better world is to create a knowledge economy everywhere. What does that mean? That means you take young people and you expose them to content and you make sure that they learn something before they leave school, so they have knowledge. You can't produce that knowledge unless you're a teacher who has some knowledge. And so we look for people with PhDs, right? So apparently the PhD means you know something. That's why we do these national searches to find people with big credentials, because that means that they know something. We think that if you know something, then you can transfer that to others. So we put you on stage and you give a talk like I'm doing right now. The way we organize people to learn in this traditional way of thinking, we put them in rows of seats with a blackboard or a stage, which is what I bet most of you are doing right now at Clarkson. How do you know if it worked? It's about what you know. So this has been a success if you know something now that you didn't know before. So a good friend of mine, Howard Gardner at Harvard, says the way you know if learning happened is that you ask people this question. And it says, I used to think X, but now I think Y. What are X and Y? So as a teacher in this methodology, you're trying to constantly add knowledge. However, there's a problem with this methodology. It's called Google. So one of the ways, and in fact, our family still does this, it's fun. If you watch the Jeopardy show during dinner, you can see people on stage with a little clicker in their hand who are asked questions about the world, some just sort of random. And if you know lots of things and you're quick with the clicker, you can win money. However, if you have Google on your phone, you can often get the answer before they do on stage without knowing anything. Knowledge now is not something that resides only in your head. It's sort of in air. The value of knowing things alone has declined significantly. Now what really matters is the maker economy. This is completely different. Now students are expected to do something with the knowledge that they have, to imitate and to perfect the things that others are doing around them. The role of the teacher has changed to being the guide on the side rather than the sage on the stage. Instead of organizing people in rows with a blackboard in front, we organize them in small groups and they're making a project of some sort. Maybe they're building a robot. Maybe they're writing a musical composition. They're doing something together. It's about what you can do with what you know. This is not, by the way, you can find this all over the world. The percentage of time spent in traditional universities everywhere that's devoted to project-based learning is increasing. And people have found that when students are involved in a project, they exercise a different part of the brain. The retention of the information goes way up. A lot of interesting things happen. But the future of education, I believe, is aimed at the innovation economy. This is fundamentally different. This isn't well understood yet, but it's not about what you put into a kid's head. It's about what comes out. We don't know actually what the role of teachers are. I have suspicion that the classroom of the future here looks more like a kindergarten than it does a university lecture hall. It's not quiet. It has a lot of inspiring things around you. If kids are going to develop the ability to generate original ideas, they need to talk. They need to try those ideas out on others. Right now, I've been trying to do this at Olin for 20 years. It's about intrinsic motivation and design thinking, but I don't think we have it fully understood. I will bet in 5 years it's something beyond that. And this is not about what you can do. It's about what you conceive, the completely new ideas. By the way, none of this is really new. If you go back and look at Yeats, education is not the filling of a pail, which is what you see on the left, but the lighting of a fire, which is what you see on the right. In learning theory, you also find that as you move from the knowledge economy to the innovation economy model, it's about increasing student engagement. And we know that the more that students are engaged in what they learn, the more they understand and retain this information. It's not about memorizing what's on a flashcard. You can't forget what you understand. You can only forget what you remember. Now, why education must change? I've been really impressed with this graph of world population growth throughout all of history. And look at this. On the left, it's the old Stone Age, 2 to 5 million years ago. And the whole thing looks like a hockey stick until you get to about 1900. And then it starts going up to maybe between 1 to 2 billion. We're now at about 8 billion, on our way up to 10 billion by the middle of this century. The planet has never seen this many people before. Now, the occurrence of this spike, a couple of things. Didn't happen randomly at any point in time. It happened now. Why? And I believe it happened because it's primarily the impact of technology. It's the technology that we've applied to minimize the causes of death on the planet. In 1900, the average lifespan in the US was in the 40s, maybe 46, something like that. The most common cause of death in 1900 was waterborne disease. We didn't know about penicillin yet. We didn't know about viruses yet. In 2000, 100 years later, the most common cause of death is cancer, heart disease. And the lifespan is in the mid to late 70s. Lately, because of COVID, it's dropped a couple of years, but technology has limited the causes of death. It's not that our fertility has suddenly exploded. But if you look at this graph, it's not unlike what population biologists have seen. For example, the population of rabbits in the outback in Australia, when you eliminate the wolves, looks like that. Without changing their behavior, the rabbits will simply breed themselves out of existence. There won't be enough food to eat, and they will eliminate their own habitat, and they'll be gone. And there's concern that we could do that too. We have a lot of thinking that's built in about the year 1000 when the modern university model was created, but we're still teaching that way, even though the challenges that the world will face are fundamentally different. So, for example, in 2008, the National Academy of Engineering set out 14 grand challenges for the 21st century. These were concerns that if we don't deal with these, they will limit the quality of life on the planet for everyone. Of course, these were also related or correlated to the Sustainable Development Goals in the UN. There's a mapping between the two, although the UN goals extend beyond what we might think of as physical science and engineering. How do you educate young people differently to deal with these? These are global, complex, multidisciplinary challenges. Complex in the sense that some might call wicked problems because they have human behavior embedded in them. They're not predictable. These involve 4 major areas of security, sustainability, health, and enhancing life. It's the unintended consequences that require systems thinking that is going to be the framework that makes this work. These are largely coupled scientific, social, economic, political, and religious problems all at the same time. So to breaking them up into parts and studying social science or studying economics or religious behavior is not enough to make a start on these problems. I just got to point out that the Grand Challenge Scholars Program, which was created in 2009, is designed to prepare change makers to solve the world's grand challenges. It's now adopted by more than 90 universities internationally, and you can find out more about this from their website. By the way, this particular project won the 2022 Bernard M. Gordon Prize for Innovation in Engineering and Technology Education. So there's an intervention that's already well along in trying to create innovators for these big problems. However, as we sit back and reflect on this, our traditional approach to higher education may actually be preventing us from producing the innovators that we need. There's a really interesting book by Tony Wagner at Harvard on what it takes to create innovators. If you think about this, and by the way, not everybody that comes out of college needs to be an innovator. We need people who do more traditional things as well. Nevertheless, when problems become unpredictable and life-threatening, somebody needs to be thinking completely new about this. And this is sort of the core of what we've been thinking about. This might be a map of a large traditional state university. Let's pick on Michigan for a minute. I don't think Michigan is going to get hurt too much by what we say. This may be a map where the engineering quad is in this blue circle in the upper left. The business school is in the green circle. And the heart of the arts and sciences campus is down in the red circle. Maybe it's close to the Rackman Library in the middle of the campus. Now, these are far apart from each other, so maybe 2 miles between the centers of these circles. If you're an engineering student at a school like that, you spend 3/4 of your time inside the blue circle. Almost everybody that stands in front of you has a PhD, and it's almost always in some form of engineering, science, or math. And what they're teaching you, if you listen, what's the point of what they're saying? It's about feasibility. Almost everything that they teach is to teach you about what's possible based on what we know about natural science. That's the point of engineering and science as it's taught in traditional universities. On the other hand, across the campus in the viability circle where the business school is, they teach things differently. They're now teaching you about what's possible financially. Nothing happens that isn't financially viable. So almost everything they do, from legal viability to financial viability, is about what you can do in the business world. On the other hand, by the way, those are often measured with spreadsheets, and the engineering science courses are often measured with vectors and calculus and equations. Down in the red circle in the middle, where it's not about engineering or business, it's about arts and sciences. Often the kinds of questions that are asked are very different. They're questions like, what is the meaning of beauty? Or what is the meaning of truth? Or what is the meaning of love? You don't measure these things with graphs and equations. These are measured by human desire, the things that motivate people. So we deliberately, the way we organize universities, we separate people out to become specialists in these particular ways of thinking. So in fact, the feasibility and viability and desirability are distinct characteristics of the education that we produce. Now, there's a problem with this. And the problem is that if you want to create innovation, something, an idea, an application of a new idea in a way that changes the way people live, it has to be simultaneously feasible, viable, and desirable. You have to have all 3 of those things in one head, not separated out into different specialists who then have trouble talking with each other. I'll challenge you to think of an innovation on a broad scale that isn't simultaneously feasible, viable, and desirable. What do we learn from this? Well, no amount of emphasis on narrow specialization of courses will produce the innovators that we need. Somehow, we need to integrate this again. There's an interesting book co-authored by John Seeley Brown, who some of you might remember. John Seeley Brown was the chief scientific officer for Xerox. In fact, he presided over the Xerox PARC, the Palo Alto Research Center, which spawned the personal computer. When he left Xerox, he became interested in how learning will happen. And he paints a picture in here, a new culture of learning, which is contrasted with the traditional one in ways that I think are very instructive. First off, the traditional view of learning is about transferring knowledge, like memorizing flashcards. The new method of learning is about constructing knowledge in your head. So there is a fair amount of experimentation and trying out new ideas. The old model is about can't do. You can't take this course unless you have the prerequisites. The new model is about can do. It's about envisioning what it's never been. The old model is about following orders. Time's up, put your pencil down. If you still have a pencil in your hand, you're going to lose points. The new method is follow your passions. It's what do you really care about? The old model was learn in class. You had to be there at 8. And if you're absent, you get a demerits. On the new model is about learning 24/7. Maybe you do that at home if you're a student. The old model was learning alone. Don't talk to your neighbor. That's cheating. The new model is learning in teams. If you don't learn in teams, you won't be able to work well in the industry. The old model is problem-based, like the problem sets I did a gazillion years ago. The new model is design-based. This is really different. It exercises a different part of your brain because before you can define the solution, you have to really think about defining the problem. It's what we call problem finding. By the way, all of this new model of learning is not new. It's actually the pedagogy that's very much like graduate school. But you might say, but look, Rick, if it's about graduate school, why are you trying to do this at the undergraduate level? There's no way it's going to work. My answer is, have you ever heard of the Montessori schools? These start in kindergarten, 5-year-olds. Their preferred way of teaching K-12 for many CEOs' children. This is another way of organizing learning, which produces different outcomes. My favorite quote from the book: for most of the 20th century, our educational system has been built on the assumption that teaching is necessary for learning to occur. What an idea. Maybe it's not. Now, 20th century innovators require more than specialized knowledge. I think this has been so slow for us in the higher education field to understand. Here it's about attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs. And more often than not, your attitude determines your altitude in life, not your aptitude. Interesting quote, motivation almost always beats raw talent, by Norm Augustine, who is the former CEO of Lockheed Martin Corporation, head of the National Academy of Engineering, a lot of other things. This, of course, was quoted a couple of years ago in Aviation Week on space technology. In fact, industry has been telling us this for at least 30 years. This is why Mr. Milas said there's a lot of unhappiness about the way engineering is taught today. These are largely groups of industry professionals who have written on what the new skill set is for engineering. National Academy of Engineering had an initiative, Educate to Innovate. The Council on Competitiveness, the National Engineering Forums about capacity, capability, and competitiveness. STEM Connector, which is 200 corporations, wrote a treatise on the characteristics of the new workforce about employability skills was the #1 requirement, and then innovation excellence. Hard skills was #4. By the way, in all the years that I was a dean and president of an engineering school, I don't remember ever being approached by a corporate leader who told me they were disappointed with the technical skills of the graduates that our engineering schools were producing. Apparently, we're doing that just fine. IBM, the T-shaped individual, which is about lifelong learners, ready to work on teams, and to collaborate, ready to build a smarter planet, empathetic, analytical thinkers. These are their attempts to tell us what I believe are 5 mindsets: a collaborative mindset, an entrepreneurial mindset, an interdisciplinary mindset, a global mindset, and an ethical mindset. These are fundamentally critical tools for success of the engineering enterprise in the future. Now, when I first heard this, I was a little worried. Mindset. It sounds like one of those things that you hear about in a self-help book in the airport. But in fact, it's real. Carol Dweck, professor of psychology at Stanford, has a book called, which I think is very accessible. I think you should get this book if you haven't already seen it. A Mindset, the New Psychology of Success. And data that she shows is how what the students believe about themselves has a very strong influence on their success in life. So if they believe, for example, that doing well in school is the result of being intelligent, and that's it. And if intelligence is something you inherit from your parents, like your eye color, then you're either born intelligent or you're not. If you have that belief, it's what she calls a fixed mindset, and you can see what happens to students' trajectory through school if you do that. On the other hand, if you believe that your success in school is the result of the kind of intelligence that grows with exercise, like a muscle, then the more you use it, the better you get at using it and at using it to learn in school. And you got on a completely different trajectory. Fundamental concept, which we could talk more about. Angela Duckworth at Penn has this research on the power of passion and perseverance. By the way, this can be traced to James Heckman at the University of Chicago, who's a Nobel Prize winner in economics. His thesis is that grit, or perseverance and passion, is often a better predictor of success than knowledge or intelligence. So if you really want to help students be successful, and if you want to help this country develop a workforce that succeeds, you want to find a way to cultivate grit, perseverance, and passion. By the way, there's lots of dimensions to this mindset and attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs. This is a picture of Dr. Mel Ramey, who was my undergraduate advisor when I arrived as a freshman at the University of California at Davis. Mel was the first person with a PhD that I ever met, and he's the first person who was an engineer that I ever met. His behavior demonstrated crystal clear, like a beacon for me, that hopeful faculty members spread hope among their students, while cynical faculty members spread cynicism. Have you ever heard of a cynical entrepreneur? You haven't, because it's an oxymoron. Entrepreneurs are people who always believe there could be a better way if only we did X or if we did Y. I later learned that Mel, in fact, was a coach, and his mindset was not just that of a structural engineering teacher. His mindset was that of an Olympic coach. In fact, I think 3 of his former students have Olympic gold medals in track and field. Coaches don't give up on people, and they're not easy to work with. They are demanding, and they require a lot of accountability, but you know they believe in you. He was a mentor. I would rather die than disappoint Mel. There's no app for my iPhone that I would die for. Human connection is fundamental. By the way, making universities and engineering schools exciting, creative, adventurous, rigorous, demanding, and empowering milieus is more important than specifying curricular details. This is a quote from Dr. Charles Vest, a former president of MIT and the US National Academy of Engineering. He's a great mentor of mine, and I think he got it right. My last slide, and then we're going to open for Q&A. I said that I stepped away from Olin a couple of years early, feeling an obligation to share some of what we had learned with those who do not study engineering. You know, the 95% of the student body in the US who are not engineers. This led me to co-found a group called the Coalition for Life Transformative Education. It's a group right now of 15 universities that includes everything from Bates College and Wellesley College and Bucknell University and Wake Forest and Arizona State University, University of Virginia and MIT and others, who are all looking for ways to look beyond the completion of a college degree and the getting of a job. They're looking for producing life that is, you might call, characterized by human flourishing, years, decades after graduation. Our beacon on this is the results of the research that Gallup did together with Purdue about 5 or 6 years ago, when they developed what's called the Gallup-Purdue Index. They showed 2 things really persist decades after graduation. Students who are positive in answering these questions have twice the well-being 20 years after they graduate. Number 1, someone cared about me as a person. Think about that. It doesn't take any more time to be kind to someone than it does to be rude. Almost everyone I know in higher education is here because our life was changed by some teacher that we knew. That should be the animating feature of your life as a teacher. The other one is I had an opportunity to apply what I learned in the real world while I was still a student. So college is not about books and tests, it's about life. So a good education changes what you know, but a great education changes who you are. That's my current work at this moment, and I would welcome anybody who's still awake to answer questions. To ask questions. And here's how you can reach me.
Well, thank you, Rick. Yes, we will certainly, hopefully have some great questions here. We have some people in the room. If you'd like to answer a question in the room, please let me know, and I'll also try to monitor the questions coming in online. But maybe I'll kick it off, Rick. You talked compellingly about the importance of students having the right mindset. And I also highly recommend Carol Dweck's book. A lot of that mindset comes from the way people were raised and the types of values that were displayed in their families. You talked about grit as being important and attitude. Not all students come in to a university environment with a high level of self-awareness of the importance of those things. Do you do anything at Olin that helps the students become more aware of those qualities that are so important?
Yes, I mentioned the admission project where we're using what's called Candidates Weekend to try and select students. One of the things that I found is that not every student, when they become 18, is ready for this kind of learning, where it's what I would call mostly expeditionary learning rather than learning from a book. How do you find that out? You put them in small teams and you ask them to solve problems, real problems. So during that Olin partner year that I mentioned back in 2001, we noticed when we put the faculty around a table trying to think about this, what does it mean to be educated in the 21st century? What does it mean to be an engineer in the 21st century? We just went around the table and asked you this simple question: what do you remember about your undergraduate education? That turns out to be a pretty humbling question. In my case, I remember I had quantum mechanics once, but don't ask me to solve a problem in this. However, I can remember what I was eating at the time the idea occurred to me why my senior project was not working. That retention was uniform across the group. Everybody could remember extraordinary details about the project that they worked on. And then we asked sort of the obvious question, since we all had this. And by the way, it was all in the senior year. Why? Well, we thought that there must be a reason, because we all do it. Probably you need to have 2 years of calculus and physics before you can pick up a wrench. Otherwise, Zeus, the Greek god, is up there with lightning bolt, will strike you dead if you pick up the wrench before you got a B in physics. No, it requires a curiosity, a need to do something to make things better. This is why the Grand Challenges Scholars Program is so successful and so important. So what did we do? We decided to challenge students. Turns out the students that we run into most of the time appreciate a challenge. Now, there's some special cases here I'll touch in a minute. We decided to test the theory that you needed to have 2 years of calculus and physics before you could do anything in the shop. So we had 18-year-olds arrive that year who had no college education at all. They had just graduated from high school. And within weeks, we put them on small teams and we gave them a challenge. We want you to design, build, and demonstrate a pulse oximeter. They said, excuse me, a what? So we wrote the word out. Now I think most people know what it is because of COVID. They said, sure, fine. Where do we learn about it? We told them, why don't you go to the internet and find the patent literature? Because the guy who invented this had to have a little schematic diagram and a page or two that describes how it works. We have some tools over there. This is not an SAT test. You can talk to your neighbors, or if you have a father who works at a hospital, go and look at one. We don't care, but you only have 5 weeks to build this thing. And, we were convinced this was impossible. This would never happen. And so we were shocked when 5 weeks later they had one built and working. We thought this was some fluke that couldn't possibly happen. We wound up doing things like this again and again. The next thing we asked them to do was to get everybody's name in the Guinness Book of World Records before Thanksgiving by building something cool. And then we competed with the NASA Marsport competition, which you might know has to do with developing a solution to some element of preserving life on Mars for planetary exploration. And they competed in the math competition. They did all kinds of things that they were not supposed to be able to do. The adventure of learning, particularly learning in a group and doing something that matters, is infectious, and we believe can transform people's mindsets. Now, it's harder, I believe, when you come from an environment where is resource deprived and people don't expect to succeed. you have to work a little harder as the teacher to find a project that will exceed their own expectations. They won't believe they can do this, and you better not do it for them. You better drop breadcrumbs down a path and scaffold it once in a while till they exceed their own expectations. When that happens, you can see this light bulb go off in their head. There's still a great deal of skepticism, well, they must have known something about this that makes it not real. If you do that 3 times in a row, you've got them, okay? Now your skepticism that I can't succeed is gone. Carol Dweck's work kicks in. They now have a growth mindset, okay? But this business of unstructured learning, not reading the book, copying the equation, doing 3 problems that are exactly the same, making sure you get the right answer, that's a very hard habit to break.
Okay, we have a question from the audience here asking how important is the Grand Challenge Scholars Program in the transformation of engineering education and in achieving the mindsets that you talk about? Can you talk about the impact of that program?
It's really interesting. The Grand Challenge Scholars Program is not what most people think. It's not a curriculum. It's a set of goals, and it's a set of mindsets that we challenge universities to develop in their own students. So we challenge them to develop an interdisciplinary mindset, an entrepreneurial mindset, a collaborative mindset, a global mindset, and an ethical mindset. And we leave it up to the university to come up with ways to achieve that. Rather than prescribe it and say, this is the course notes that you need to use, this is the book that you use, which I think would have been the death of the whole thing. It challenges people to be creative. It's a kind of intervention, which I'd say is quite mild. It doesn't touch the ABET accreditation criteria. You don't have to stop taking calculus and start taking this squishy thing instead. This is an extracurricular. It's an add-on, but it's become incredibly popular. It particularly attracts a disproportionate number of women and a disproportionate number of underrepresented people because it's empowering. For example, one of the most interesting recent developments from the Grand Challenge Scholars Program, which is now, I believe, adopted by 97 universities globally, was what happened when COVID hit, March of 2020. We created the COVID call to action among all alumni and university participants in the Grand Challenge Scholars Program. And within hours, I think in less than 2 or 3 days, we had interventions that were coming from students about how we could contribute to solutions of the COVID problem. One illustration was, you may remember in those days, there was a shortage of masks and of gloves. We couldn't get enough of them. So a group of students with a faculty member at one of our member universities challenged students to invent a way to disinfect the existing masks and gloves in universities by using ultraviolet light. And they built plywood boxes with an ultraviolet light in them that disinfected the existing material within an hour. Distributed them to hospitals all over major cities. And then, of course, we connected them with I-Corps people who were dealing with entrepreneurial ventures and business leaders who could help fund these things. And a number of new companies came out of this. Now, did that solve the major crisis in COVID? No, I think you'd have to say vaccines are the primary reason why things got better quickly, but it changed the students. They saw their education not as something that has to do with books and tests, but has to do with life. They look for ways to change the world. So you get people like Frances Haugen when you do that.
Thank you. The next question from our president, Mark Christensen.
So Olin's widely recognized as an innovator in this space, and we all know innovation is tied to failure. So I wonder if you might expose to us some of the failures that happened along the way and how you course corrected.
We don't have enough time to go through all the things that we failed at.
Pick your earliest one.
But we don't talk about failure, okay? Here's the deal. If you were in English class in high school and you had to write an essay, would you consider it a failure if you had to use an eraser? Would you consider it a failure if you had to iterate a few times before you got it into the shape that you needed to turn it in? By the way, is it ever done? Couldn't you have done it better if you had even more time? This is exactly what happens with every invention in society as well. Now, some of the things that we did that turned out not to succeed, but on the other hand, we're now seeing their ways to get around it a decade later. When we started, we were quite impressed with a project that had evolved at Rose-Hulman Institute, which I think is a really fine engineering school. It was called the integrated course block approach, where the idea is integrated learning. They put fundamental physics, mathematics, and engineering design in one course. So it's like a giant course now. It's like 12 credit hours. You enroll in this at the same time. You have the faculty members go have lunch together. So they sequence things and they integrate them so they show up just at the right time. We tried that. We abandoned that a year or two later. The problem was that it was too heavy to get off the runway. So we would bring students in with a diverse set of backgrounds and then discover that maybe they were really good at math. Maybe they went to a rural high school in some state that's mostly agrarian, didn't have an opportunity to take a really good physics class. And we threw them into the water with these kids who came from, Bronx Science High School in New York. And they just spent their whole time trying to catch up. So you got to the end of the course. What do you do with that? Did they pass? They really needed some time to catch up in the physics area. They were fine in the math area, and so you were forced with the idea of repeating the entire 12 credit hours in order to catch that one thing up. So we abandoned it and we completely reinvented the math program. So here's another thing that happened. We sent our first group of kids out with this integrated math, and they went to really good places. About half of our kids go on for graduate work. I think 30% of them go to Harvard, Stanford, MIT, or Carnegie Mellon, and they're in the PhD program. So we got these letters back from kids who went to Stanford, and they said, please fix the math program, okay? These kids that we're sitting in the first year classes with have had a lot more exposure than we have to a lot of these things. We're making it, by the way, nobody failed the qualifying exam. They just had to work really hard to do it. But we decided to reinvent the entire math program. So in 11 months, we threw it out and replaced it entirely with a new sequence called linearity. So this business of failure is inherent. We don't call it failure, we call it iterative improvement. There are retreats, I believe. Now, again, I've been gone for a couple of years and COVID's gotten in the way, so this may have changed the schedule some, but we have retreats twice a year in the J term, which is between the fall and spring, and at the end of the spring term, where the faculty meet with only one agenda, and that's to understand what worked and what's not working, and to plan the big changes and interventions that are going to start over the summer.
Our next question focuses on faculty, and our person comments, I can't agree strongly enough with your assertion that a good engineering education is a well-rounded one. This necessitates changes in pedagogy, which may be difficult for faculty who were raised in a more conventional learning, teaching, and accreditation framework. As much as you are experimenting with changes to educating students, have you explored ways to change how faculty are trained to teach in this new framework?
Absolutely. This is really the core. If you can't, look, you can only teach what you know. And if you've never done anything like this, it's going to be a long time before you dive in the deep end and try to make your career around it. So Olin has experimented with a number of ways to prepare faculty for teaching in this method. For example, it's very common at Olin to interview faculty members in groups rather than individually, to ask them, and by the way, not with people from the same discipline. So we have, for example, a sociologist who teaches entrepreneurship. We have a biologist who teaches engineering design. We bring in people from the beginning and commonly assign them to teach in teams in the first year. Secondly, we rarely assign them to teach a specialty course in their PhD discipline. So you're exposed to teaching things you don't feel like you're an expert in. In other words, you experience what the students experience, okay? And we asked the students, this is back from the Olin partner year, when we started the Olin partner year, and we brought these 15 boys and 15 girls in, we told them, when people ask you where you're going to college, tell them you're building your own, okay? And of course they came, and now we have to make good on this. So nobody calls me President Miller at Olin. They don't call me Professor Miller. They don't call me Dr. Miller. They call me Rick, okay? I have a brother who's the CEO of an entrepreneurial company, engineering company in Silicon Valley, and nobody calls him by names other than his first name either. It's a methodology by which you invite everybody around the table to have a voice. You have to have the courage to speak up and to try things new. So this whole strategy is counter to what I learned in graduate school. When I left Caltech, I had a series of lecture notes on continuum mechanics and advanced dynamics and so forth. And it was a drama performance is what it really was. I've done it so many times. I could put this picture on the blackboard and these equations and almost count the seconds until the question came up that I knew was going to come up. And then I could nail it with such precision that it's like God told me exactly how to derive the Navier-Stokes equations from thin air. I did something different on a challenge because I was too young to know better. When I was teaching at USC in aerospace engineering at the time, I taught engineering design for this aerospace field. I'd never had any courses in engineering design. Caltech didn't do that in those days. So what we did is we put students in teams. I asked my colleagues in industry to send me a one-page summary of the project they were working on, just the technical part. We put them in a folder. We asked students to pick one and told them to try and solve it by the end of the semester. They just did their best to try and solve this problem. And at the end of the semester, we brought the corporate leaders together to watch what they'd done. And the idea was that we'd then put the corporate originator of the idea at the lunch table with the kids who worked on it, and the corporate leader can tell them how you really solve the problem. That was the big idea, okay? It practically killed me as a teacher because I had no idea what the questions were going to be. I couldn't be the sage on the stage anymore. So we do this kind of forcing faculty members to think interdisciplinary methodology with people outside of their discipline to learn with the students, not to tell the students what to do. And that we do this in this summer institute that that you've mentioned before that Olin does every summer. One of the most common consequences of doing this with faculty is very common imposter syndrome. How can I possibly be teaching a course in entrepreneurship? My background is in sociology. I didn't get a PhD in this area. It's a pretty serious thing. You can't stand up and pretend like you're the world's expert in this anymore because you're not. We even involved some of the work of Brene Brown. I don't know if you know who Brene Brown is, the psychologist, about vulnerability. Because you can't teach in this way without becoming vulnerable, exposing what you don't know. So there is a transformation, and not every faculty member is a good fit for Olin, but it's something you take deliberately. We basically found that Olin doesn't lose very many faculty members to other places. They tend to love it there.
So maybe just to follow up on that, kind of getting to your aircraft carrier tugboat model, you have the opportunity to do a lot of innovative experimentation, and this dovetails into a question from Dr. Regel as well. What types of things would you recommend for larger, more traditional universities in the things that you would recommend that we try to change our direction? No, nobody is smart enough to know how to change the program at XYZ University from a distance. Only the people who are there understand the capabilities of their own students. So my primary advice to almost everyone is to do your version
of our Olin Partner Year. Experiment with your own students, with your own resources. Try things you think will fail and see how they work. I've done this all over the world. I was involved in a World Bank project in Kazakhstan, where they were trying to build what's now Nazarbayev University. And rather than trying to copy what Berkeley does, buy the curriculum, use the same textbooks and expect the same outcomes when you don't have the same students coming from high school and the same faculty, why don't you do an invention on your own? I've seen this work in many other environments, and I believe it would be much wiser for you to find a few of your own faculty who are creative, who are idealistic, who are interested in trying new things. Don't bet the farm on it. Make it a small elective thing on the side and judge it based on the outcomes. And so the people who've done this the best, by the way, are the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. There's a book on this called A Whole New Engineer, which is co-authored by Mark Somerville, who's the provost at Olin now, and David Goldberg, who was a senior faculty member at Illinois. They came and looked at what happened at Olin. They went home with 3 big ideas. They decided to try them out across the Illinois campus, and they exceeded expectations. They're the ones who coined this idea, which they call the Olin effect, which is really a reshaping of attitudes, behaviors, and beliefs in the students, which results in an increased performance. So I guess that's the closest I can come. I'm not going to give you, do these 3 things and the world will be better. It doesn't work that way.
Right. Questions from the audience here? One more, Rick. In terms of, can you comment a little bit? You talked about the knowledge maker and innovation learning models and moving from what you know to what you do to what you can conceive. Clearly, though, even if you get up to that, what might be considered the higher level of innovation and conceiving, you still need to have your students be competent doers and knowers. Can you comment a little bit on how you package all of that into a 4-year experience? I recall reading early in your experiment that there was the project-based learning can cause a high amount of stress with students. You demand quite a bit of them. Now you're asking them to be conceivers, doers, and knowers. How do you manage all of that? Yeah,
well, it's got to be student-driven, number one. Students do their best when they're excited about what they're doing and they really care about the outcome. So feeding that stress, here's the deal. You can be in an environment where a lot is required of you, a great deal of time is spent, and at the end of the day, you just feel completely drained. Or you can be in the same exact environment and feel completely energized, depending on your mindset. So the data that I'm most fond of at Olin, Princeton Review, I'm sure you know about this. This is the student surveys across the country. Olin students, I understand, this year ranked number 1 in the US on the question, students never stop studying. This is not a party school. This is not a place to go if you want to be drunk every Friday night and blow off the homework. But if you interview the students at the water cooler, they'll tell you this. Yes, I've never worked this hard at anything in my life, but there's nothing else I'd rather be doing. That's when you got it right. So how do you kickstart that? So if there's nothing else you'd want to be doing, here's the simple way. It's engage students in things that they care about. Here's a simple stepping stone. I used to teach math at the University of California, Santa Barbara, applied math. And I teach from the same book. I think it was Kreissig's book on advanced calculus. Probably most everybody knows that book. And I would use the same problems at the end of the chapters. Do problem 6, number 19, number 23, turn them in. Don't do that. Don't do that. Get to that chapter and say, pick 3 problems at the end of the chapter that look interesting to you. A little bit of voluntary selection on the part of the students goes a long ways towards improving their mindset and their sense of, I'm learning something that I want to learn. An even stronger motivation is what we're doing in this coalition for life transformative education. And that's about purpose. We find that there are 3 steps to human development and education that are fundamental. First one is identity development. I am somebody, I can succeed, I will succeed. Next is agency. Through experience, I believe now, I'm confident that I can make this happen. And finally, in the top of the pyramid is purpose. There's a purpose to my life. That's usually about doing things for others. If you get students doing something for others, and I'll just give you one short illustration of this. We have this course, it's called Engineering for Humanity. I think that's the right course name. I'm getting a little bit old now, so maybe I'm inventing words a little. This is about solving a problem for people in the community. So in this case, a group of faculty, including, I believe, anthropologists, go out and identify people in need, and they interview them for a long period of time, and then they invent a solution to their problem by listening to them using design thinking. In this case, I think they went to people who were elderly, and they spent 20 hours in nursing homes listening to people in their 80s talk about their greatest challenges in life. They came back and brainstormed about what things they could do to make their life better. And then they came back to them. In fact, the story's too long to tell you the whole thing, but these people were really worried about their future. And in fact, they were worried about their health, and they were worried about being in a wheelchair. Almost every one of them told us that they had met someone in their living unit in the last 2 years who fallen and broke a hip. And in some cases, the hip didn't heal, and they were confined to a wheelchair. This was absolutely terrifying to the people in the nursing home. But the 18-year-old kids at Olin didn't quite get it at first until they spent time interviewing 20 hours in a nursing home. And they found out that if you're in a wheelchair, you can't look people in the eye ever again. You look at their belt buckle when they come to visit you. They always look down on you. And even your family, when they come to visit you, tend to congregate behind you in a group and talk about you in the third person. You're no longer a person now. You're a problem for people to solve. So if this happens to you, it's like the end of life that you know. And then there's some secondary consequences, which are not quite so profound. You can't burn calories anymore, so you can't control your weight. And in fact, even finding out how much you weigh is a big ordeal because people have to hold you up by the elbows on the scale, and it's embarrassing. They just don't want to deal with it. So our kids went home and they decided, well, we're only like 19. I don't think we're going to fix the aging problem today. Maybe we can do something about their weight. So they invented what they called, well, it's a little carpet with pressure sensors under it and an RFID radio transmitter that transmits the pressures to an app on your iPhone, which then tells you, today you weigh 150 pounds. And of course, they're speculating this, and they come back and bring this to the same people, 10 people at nursing homes, and told them, we're thinking about this. What do you think? And their eyes lit up, and they said 2 things. Number one, you actually listen to me. You don't know how rare that is. People don't visit us here, number one. And when they do, they don't really care what we say, that they brought us some flowers or something. You really listened. Number 3, can you actually make this thing? And they will say, actually, we don't know. We don't have a course in how to make, carpets with pressure sensors, but we'll find out. And they came home, and 4 months later, they built a prototype. It's called lily pad scales. And they decided to build a prototype and then build a business model around it and go to Babson College next door and compete for the business prize competition, which they won. And they came home with like $10,000, and they went into their residence hall and they started building them, and they sold them over the holiday break. You can still buy them. You can Google it, and you can find lily pad scales. I think there were 3 kids on that project. One of them decided to turn down graduate school to stay with this, to see what happens when you start a new one. The important part of the story, though, is the reaction of the people in the nursing home to the fact that these kids listened, brought them a project that changed their lives. That brought purpose into the lives of these kids. I think that is why Olin is ranked #1 and the kids never stop studying. It's not because they have a passion for grades on a homework paper.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll scan the audience for any last questions. And if not, I'll ask Mark to join me here. And Rick, we're going to present you here with a
Oh, wow.
certificate, thanking you for giving a very inspiring talk this evening. We will make sure we get this to you through Dr. Regel. But we want to thank you for a very inspiring talk tonight.
Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to be with your group. I'm so pleased with what Clarkson is doing. I have known your community for years, just not had the opportunity to visit. Thank you again.
Very good. Well, we hope to get you up here sometime. But I'd like to thank everybody for attending. And again, let's all thank Dr. Miller for his talk this evening. With that, we're going to end the webinar. Thank you, Rick. Thank you, audience.